Masal Khair, good afternoon. For those of you, this session is in English, so for those of you who need translation, there is translation. You'll have to ask for the headphones and make sure you get the Arabic. I'm pleased to welcome you all, our distinguished guests who have accepted to join us in this conversation. This is what I would like to call this event. It's no secret that the crisis of Syrian refugees is of unprecedented magnitude. Figures are eloquent: 700,000, maybe more, Syrians have sailed from the shores of Turkey and Libya, from Libya, to Lampedusa or to Lesbos, Chios, Kos, and other islands, and some 3,000 or more lost their lives in the sea. And there's much talking about how did Europe react to this, and people sometimes tend to see what European countries are doing through the prism of politics. So they see Marine Le Pen winning regional elections in France, so they say, look, Europe looks at refugees increasingly as a threat. I'm not sure this is true. There are still in Europe many people who do not look at them as a threat. I read a very interesting statement of Jean-Claude Juncker where he says, let's make sure we don't allow ISIS to dictate our refugee policy. And I think this is extremely important, and I'm sure that this remark of Juncker is widely shared in Europe. Now, we're in a conversation mode, as I said. We at this Policy Institute of the American University in Beirut have been working on the Syrian refugee issue, mostly on the refugees in Lebanon. We've produced recently a report on housing, on shelter. It's available for those of you who would like to have a look at it. But we're also interested in what is happening in Europe, for it certainly will impact the life of Syrian refugees in Lebanon. Many of them are tempted to go from Tripoli to Turkey and again sail. Some even buy forged Syrian passports to claim. Some Lebanese and Palestinians do that. So Lebanon is directly affected by what is happening in Europe, in addition to the presence of so many Syrian refugees in Lebanon. And Lebanon has gone through difficulties. Recently, when we were told that the national funds that were supposed to help us cope with this problem are not as they used to be, but then this reality may change again. I was telling our colleagues a while ago that when the European Union and Turkey reached an agreement, it has its own political motivations for sure, but that and Turkey has its own way, has had its own track record of dealing with Syrian refugees. Yet, the European Union felt that Turkey needed help in order to be able to limit the flow of Syrian refugees into Europe and control better its borders. And therefore, the European Union has given Turkey substantial support to do that. Now, many are asking the question, will this ever happen to Lebanon and Jordan? I mean, these are some of the questions that are, I think, on many people's minds. But the main purpose of this exercise is to listen to the panelists telling us what their countries are doing, what are their policies, where are the zones of countries and the international organizations, UNHCR, and where are policies unclear, where are they controversial. Perhaps they would like to venture into some prospective thinking. How do they see this developing in the future? I think they should feel free, and I'm extremely grateful to them to have responded positively to our invitation. Ambassadors normally do not give lectures and sit on panels. It's not very common. We're pleased that all of them have come. Only one had to apologize. This morning we got a call from Michelle Cameron, the Canadian ambassador. She said she's busy processing a number of Syrian refugees' dossiers, and they're in a hurry because the Canadians have decided to take up to 25,000 Syrians before the end of this year. So the rush on the embassy to get applications processed is such that she couldn't even spare an hour or two to come and join us. So she sent her apologies. Theodore Prassas, the Greek ambassador, has kindly asked Panos Leousis, who is his deputy and the Consul General of Greece in Lebanon, to speak on his behalf. The ambassador is busy with the Director General of Greeks abroad at the Foreign Ministry Greece, who's visiting Lebanon, so he couldn't come. But Greece is well represented in this panel. I'm very pleased to welcome you all. Ambassador Christina Lassen, she's the head of the European Union delegation in Lebanon. Ambassador Martin Huth is the ambassador of Germany in Lebanon. He's been in Lebanon in a previous incarnation, and he knows the country very well and speaks Arabic. Ambassador Massimo Marotti is in Lebanon since a few months. He's been in Iraq before, and he's very sensitive to the problems of this country. And then we have the UNHCR representative, Madame Mireille Girard, who will give us also her perspective and all the factual information that is available to her organization. So as I said, this is a conversation. The ambassadors are not making official statements on behalf of their government. That's not the purpose. They're simply sharing with us what they know, their reflections on the situation, their hesitations, if they have hesitations, the way they see the problem as it changes by the day. What I'll do is ask them to speak first, give them like 5 to 10 minutes. They're free to use up to 10 minutes, and then open the floor for discussion and give them another chance to reply. And I would like to start, if I may, with Ambassador Lassen.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Mitri, and thank you to the AUB and Issam Affairs Institute for organizing this very timely, but also, I think, very difficult event to speak on. I hope all of these ambassadors will not regret that they, for once, actually accepted to be in a panel, but we hope for your support in this. For me, it's also personally a pleasure to be back at the AUB. I'm always happy to be here, where I spent some very nice time a couple of years ago, and I see a lot of my old colleagues from that time. So it's always great to be here and seeing your beautiful new building. I think that all of us who sit here in this panel, we represent some of the various elements in the worldwide response, I think, to this Syrian crisis. I will try first now to come up with some of the main lines of the European Union, and then, of course, I'm very happy to have ambassadors of some of the member states here who have been the most affected. So they can say a little bit more about the individual member states, because what we have to know here is that at least when all of this started, we still had a very decentralized asylum policy in the sense that member states have a lot of the responsibilities within this. I think another thing that's important to say is clearly the crisis has not affected everyone in the same manner. Lebanon knows this better than anyone else, that the neighboring countries, of course, have been the most hit by this situation. But even in Europe, we have some countries being much more infected than others, and that, of course, also explains why the response in the various countries have been different, whether it's politically, financially, or how the countries have chosen to do this. I'll just focus right now in my introductory remarks on three main components of our response, the EU response. The first one is the assistance to the neighboring countries most affected by the crisis, and I'm sure Mireille will say more about that also. The second is the assistance now to the countries within Europe, where we're trying to help each other, basically showing solidarity with these countries who've been mostly affected by the crisis. And finally, I would say a little bit about our attempts also to strengthen border controls and make sure that our asylum procedures work the way they're supposed to in the most efficient way. And obviously all of this, and I'm sure we'll talk more about that in discussion, is very much our immediate response to this immediate crisis. But obviously I think we all know, and I'm afraid we'll not solve that today, that we have to do something much more long-term, working on something even more sustainable, working on the root causes. Many people would say that this is a generational challenge for all of us, not just something we have to handle in these years. But that's, of course, something that would take some completely different measures that I don't think we have any very, very good answers for here today. But just to say a little bit first about the assistance that we have given so far to the countries most affected by the crisis, so the neighboring countries here. All of the EU and its member states made a clear political choice since the beginning of the crisis, not just since we had migrants in Europe, but since 2012, we've really been here and in all the neighboring countries massively assisting. The EU is today, just to give a few numbers, we're the largest donor here. Together with the member states, we've given more than 5 billion euros to the Syrian, both to the efforts inside Syria and to the neighboring states. Of that, the European Union have been giving approximately half of that, so about 2.5 billion. And of that, again, of the European Union response without member states, it's 500 million euros just for Lebanon. So that's a little bit about the money, but I think what's more interesting also is how we've spent the money here. And I think unlike what many people maybe think, it's actually been a 50-50 division pretty much between directly helping the refugees, so real traditional humanitarian assistance, or not traditional, but I think we've been very innovative and using a lot of new methods, and Mireille can say much more about that. But the other part of our assistance here, and I think that goes for most of the donors now, is actually helping directly those host communities in this country who've been so generous in taking in all these people coming from across the border, but also to strengthen really the infrastructure in this country, because obviously when you suddenly have 1 million or 1.5 million extra people in your country, there's a huge strain on everything from hospitals to schools to water and electricity, sanitation, whatever it is. So really a very, very large share of what we've been doing here has been going directly to try to alleviate some of that burden here. And that's very important because obviously we hear very often, and with good reason I think, that people feel that it's really a huge burden on this country, but it's important to know that we are very aware of that, and that's really where a lot of our money is going. We've been implementing this assistance to Lebanon and other countries through a lot of our UN partners. UNHCR is one very important one of those, but also Lebanese NGOs, international NGOs. In the last months, although maybe it doesn't always feel like that, actually more and more money has been allocated to these efforts. There's a whole new EU trust fund now, where there was just another 1 billion euros decided on. It's called the Madad Trust Fund, who actually just had their first, or in principle, second board meeting last week, where they gave another 350 million euros. So all of this is a lot of numbers, but it's just to say there's huge attention there, and there's really been a lot of money allocated to this specific crisis for the countries in the region. When it comes to what we've been trying to do in Europe, obviously I think people from this region have been looking a little bit sort of in surprise of what's going on in Europe, but as you all know, it came as a surprise, which maybe it shouldn't have, for most of the EU member states, for all of us, when suddenly we had these huge influx of people coming to our borders, and maybe basically a lot of EU member states are now host countries, just as Lebanon is. Obviously, you cannot compare. We know this is a small country, we are a much bigger continent, but just to give you an idea, that just in these first 10 months of the year, we actually had more than 1 million refugees and asylum seekers arriving to Europe, and that's just in this year right now. So there is big numbers, and obviously it's something that nobody was really prepared for, so everybody has been a bit overwhelmed. It's important to know that when I say these numbers, I'm not just talking about Syrian refugees. This is maybe not so well known here, but we also have some very big groups coming from right now from Afghanistan, from Iraq, and then we have a whole different category that we don't hear a lot about here, but that Massimo from Italy will know much more about, and that's a very, very large number of also migrants from Africa, which we then tend to call economic migrants, which sounds like then it's just not so important, but of course these people are in a desperate situation too, but we in practice will treat them differently from asylum seekers fleeing from war and conflict. For this response in Europe, we've been allocating, again, lots of extra money, lots of extra resources to the member states mostly affected. We've also tried to make, and this I think got a lot of attention here, this relocation facility where we're basically trying to shuffle some of the refugees between our countries. What we agreed on after a lot of debate was to reshuffle about 160,000 refugees, and I think this is the number that a lot of people here heard in this country where they were saying 160,000, what are you talking about? We have millions here. But that was really for our internal reshuffling in this relocation mechanism. And then, of course, we've been trying to work on protection of our external borders, which I'll just come back to in a minute. But just to say again, to stay with what we've done inside Europe, we've been focusing on trying to assist those countries who are mainly concerned, and some of them are here, some of the countries who receive first a lot of the people coming in. One of the new initiatives have been to create hotspots, and in some of the most sort of the areas where really a large inflow of people would come, where basically we would send people from all the different agencies who normally deal with either refugees or border controls and try to basically assist the countries in the border areas of Europe to help them when you suddenly have thousands of people coming in with actually doing a good and structured welcome for the people coming in and making sure that everybody's registered, that everybody's treated in the way they should, but really just adding a lot of extra resources. Right now we have these hotspots in Lampedusa and Lesbos, so in Italy and Greece, but there's plans to set another 3 up very quickly. On border control, it could sound a little bit strange that we talk about this when we're talking about taking in refugees, but it's really just to make sure also that we do this in the right way, that we make sure that, as I said before, it's not everyone who can actually get in necessarily and get asylum. So there's been a lot of focus for us protecting our external borders even more. We're now working towards doing a common European border and coast guard management, something again that normally member states have been doing more on their own, but we did have a European border agency already, Frontex, that is now being beefed up very substantially. We have also tripled our presence at the sea. And this is not just to try to keep people out. On the contrary, it's actually been, after all the tragedies we've seen, and you were mentioning, Dr. Mitri, the people who died on the sea, it's been trying to assist those people also who were traveling by boat and who otherwise might have lost their lives. And a lot of, I mean, now we can say that 122,000 lives have been saved in this period after we beefed up all of this, but of course it's still way too many with the people who lost their lives already. Finally, on that point, we have also doubled our efforts to try to tackle these human traffickers and smugglers who do all of this. Basically, we see them as people who bring poor people who are fleeing from conflict into more misery just to make a lot of money out of it. So we've really been trying to increase our efforts to try to crack down of those human trafficking networks. Again, this is a little bit when we get up to the overall level and talking about root causes. Again, the people who manage to get through with human trafficking are not necessarily the people who need it the most. So we really need to go after those irregular migration flows, as we call it in a very bureaucratic expression, but really just to make sure that the people who actually get access and get asylum are really the people who need it the most. this is what I wanted to say about our main efforts so far. I think what's important to say is that if there's, I don't think you can say there's any good about this crisis, but at least for the European Union, it's forced us to say that this is actually an area where we need to work much more together. We used to have it very decentralized with the member states, as we still do with a lot of policy areas, of course. But we have just seen that with these huge challenges, we have to work even more together, make sure that we share the burden in a more solidary way. We have started working on that. We're still far from it, but as I said, for example, with common border controls, things like that is something that we hope will change the situation. We will, of course, continue to work very closely with the government of Lebanon and other governments in the region, where I think we'll only see strengthened cooperation to solve this problem as long as it's here. And I know that's very important to say. It's not like we all think that this is something that's going to stay, that people are going to stay here forever, and I'll just get back to it in a second. Because what we're talking about here is really just treating the symptoms of a bigger problem. And we know, of course, that more long-term we have to work on root causes. It's a very difficult debate. Then you start getting into discussion, what are root causes? Not necessarily a lot of agreement about that. But I think you could look at the Valletta summit we just had. You might have heard about it. The EU and some of the African countries most affected by economic migration just had a huge summit in Malta last month, where basically we were doing exactly that, trying to see how we could help these countries, basically making more favorable conditions for people to stay at home, creating jobs and creating growth. And this is, of course, something we need to look at much longer term for a lot of the countries where asylum seekers come from today. When it comes to this region, I think we all know that the crisis in Syria is the main reason. We need a political solution to the crisis in Syria. I think everybody here would agree to that, and it's obviously much easier said than done. I think in the last few months, we maybe have a little more hope that at least now there is a process with the Vienna meetings where the European Union with High Representative Mogherini are participating very actively. But obviously, this is the main source of the refugee issue in this region, and that's something we need to have solved before we can find a sustainable solution to the whole crisis, both here and in Europe. But of course, it's not going to solve everything. I think we still need, in the long term, to look more at root causes, and we can discuss once we're sort of handled the most immediate concerns. We'll have to start discussing what that is, and that's not something we can do alone. That's something that we'll have to do in cooperation also with the governments of this region. I spoke too long, Martin.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Christina.
And fast.
Thank you very much. And I think the discussion will bring up some of the issues you raised, especially political solution. No matter how we might disagree on the root causes, I think there is a universal agreement that unless a political solution is found for Syria, then this problem remains in Lebanon, in Europe, for many, many years to come. You've mentioned the two hotspots, Lesbos and Lampedusa, so I thought I should start with Italy and Greece, and then come to you and UNHCR, if you don't mind. So, Ambassador Marotti.
Good evening. Thank you, Dr. Dimitri. I'm new at the American University of Beirut. I'm very honored to be with you this evening. Talking about the refugees, Lebanese requires, first of all, respect, considering that your country is having the largest burden of what's happening today. Why Europeans are reacting the way they are doing it to the refugee crisis? I always have been asked this question about Italians in particular. In my view, what we had in Europe, and certainly in Italy, is looking first toward back. In 20 years before the crisis of today, there was another refugee crisis after the war in the former Yugoslavia. It was the largest wave of refugees after the Second World War, and now, after 22 years, we see another dramatic flow. So what happened in these 22 years in Europe, among Europeans? We had, first of all, the implementation of the Schengen Agreement, in the dismantling of the internal border and barriers, which change our life as Europeans. My son can go to study in Berlin or try to work in Austria without any difficulties. This seems a reality today, but was the effect of the changes that happened in the 90s and the beginning of the 2000s. This effect is certainly one marked like the common currency, the life of Europeans. And at that time, during these 20 years, refugees, migration were different problems and issues. They were related to the demography, to the question how a continent of 700 million might face the African continent where 1,200 million people were living, and how this could have affected the movement of population. It was mostly an academic discussion in certain time. And the number of refugees were in a way not affecting the life in countries like Italy, if not for some episodes. And then all of a sudden, this issue became changed from an emergency issue or a situation. It appears to be something structural, almost permanent, which show us how we were unprepared, how the society, the institution were badly prepared to this flow, which were coming to our shore first. Just to give you figures, in Italy, till 2 years ago, we had only places for organized to host 15,000 people. Now we have 100,000. But at the time, that was considered to be a large infrastructure to face the problem. And this was for several years. All of a sudden, 2014, 2015, we see also for the first time forced displacement. Something that was inconceivable for the youngest generation, for example, who didn't see what happened in former Yugoslavia wars. The number of irregular migrants crossing the European border increased 400% in a matter of a year. In Italy, in 2 years, 192,000 people landed on our shore. And with this logistic drama, there was also the emotional and moral drama accompanied with this. The shipwreck, which happened in October 2013, where in a single night 300 people died, shocked Italians. And while we were trying to talk, to struggle with our European friends, the European Union, how to address with the new policy all this phenomenon, we employ our Navy in a yearly operation which saved 100,000 people's lives in a matter of a year at the cost of 9 million per month. With something which was also show that we were not prepared, but we were not certainly not determined to act. But in this situation, we had to call for sound policies. We had to find the response also through governments with the European Union, looking for common policies to face the situation, devise measures, negotiate at the same time while we were facing the impact of this phenomenon. And this is the way why we moved from independent national policies to a common process. But that was not all. Through this situation, which were certainly changing the way Italians and Europeans were seeing the phenomenon, we had another element of this tragic scenario, fears and terrorism, which had an impact on public opinion, which goes beyond rationality, beyond sometimes knowledge, touching the most basic feelings of in a community. We realized all of a sudden that with the Schengen policies, we have been dismantling the internal barrier, but we didn't complete any common policies on the external borders. There was a sense so growing of certain criticism, resentment towards the institution, both national and Europeans, and the lack of proper measures and resources, how to face a phenomenon who was attacking, in the mind of few at least, the basic identity of the community. And all of a sudden we had this overlapping between what was migration or a phenomenon known in our society since the time of ancient Greeks and even before probably, to the matter of security. Not economic security, which was certainly a very familiar issue, but basic security. Police, which require other instruments. Especially when we were facing a threat which comes from Daesh, from who is using refugees as a tools, as a statehood, as a tool to disrupt life, as a tool to impose its own population on a territory emptied by people. And in a community, all these elements certainly distort probably the way this issue fell upon us in a matter of a year or so. Those are the feelings that explain, in my view, what the public opinion and the government who has to work to taking care also what the public opinion in a democratic country express had to face. And you have to keep in mind those elements, in my view, if you want to analyze or consider the way Europeans responded and arrived in a matter of a few months to all the measures that have been indicated by Christina so far, which is the beginning of a common policy. None of us, I guess, knows what will be next year the situation, what will be our common response and measure that we will be able to implement. But the basic fact of this moral and political reaction, I think, will remain. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we'll have to come back to this, and especially to the issue of border control. And it's good that you've mentioned, though, en passant, you did not stress it much. I think the Italians, at a time where you had all these tragedies in boats crossing from Libya into Lampedusa, I think they were the first, and probably it's still the most striking example of rescuing the refugees rather than simply being preoccupied with border control. And now when we speak about the fleet, whether it's Frontex or whoever that is, it's not just about, I believe, border control. It needs to be also about rescuing those who fall victims to those smugglers and who put them on those unsafe routes to cross the Mediterranean. Before I pass on, I need to recognize the President of AUB, Dr. Fadlu Khouri. We're very pleased to have you here, sir, with us this evening. So, Consul General Panos Leosis.
Thank you, Dr. Mitri. And thank also the Institute for this initiative and the invitation to the Greek Embassy in Lebanon to discuss this very crucial issue. As you know, Greece is situated at the EU's external border and is being disproportionately burdened during the last months. As much as 800,000 refugees have entered the Greek territory, mostly from the sea border with Turkey. What Greece did and continues to do its utmost to rescue refugees fleeing from war, while they struggle in their flimsy boats. In the Aegean Sea, rescued so far more than 90,000 people in almost 3,000 incidents. We have put tremendous efforts to rescue those people in need and receive them in a humane way in our frontline islands, with the aid and mobilization also of the local population. And we should not forget that Greece and the Greek people at this conjuncture are already faced with multiple challenges arising from unprecedented economic and financial crisis. So our immediate concern is to manage the extraordinary migratory flow. And for that, we believe we need a long-term comprehensive strategy that deals with all the aspects of the problem. First of all, we believe that without addressing the root causes of this phenomenon, no peace in Syria and Iraq, no stability in Afghanistan, there is no prospect for the return of the refugees. Secondly, cooperation with and assistance to third countries is important in managing the flows. Our focus primarily on Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and Egypt. We recognize that Turkey is under pressure with more than 2 million refugees, but we believe it's the key country which could stem the flows to the EU's southern eastern borders. The reality is that only on Turkish soil migratory flows can be checked and managed. Once the refugees and migrants are allowed to embark from Turkish soil, it is right too late. And while we're speaking exactly about border control, once they have embarked, there is only search and rescue, or just rescue missions, and nothing more than that. So in managing the refugee crisis, we must take action to dismantle trafficking networks of migrants which are based in Turkey, which count on the despair of people in order to make profit. So we believe that in promoting a resettlement from third countries as a durable solution, which can contribute to preventing loss of lives and deal a decisive blow to those criminal trafficking and smuggling networks. So it is necessary to proceed to the activation of the refugee resettlement process directly from Turkey to EU. And that's why we expect that the recent EU-Turkey summit will be the beginning of a fruitful cooperation in this matter. Finally, one last important matter is relocation. We believe that we must implement decisions taken concerning relocation in an effective and creative manner, and in the same time establish a permanent mechanism. Will be mandatory and equitable, and will reflect a genuine burden sharing system.
Thank you very much. I think it's worth emphasizing that Greece not only has had all that burden, did its best to receive refugees. I mean, there are many stories of people who in Lesbos or Kos or other islands, Samos as well, who tell stories about how well they were received by the Greek population, who had already suffered a lot the economic crisis Greece has gone through. I know that Greece is also getting more active politically. The foreign minister has recently convened a conference to look into the root causes and see if Greece can contribute to the political process around finding a solution to the Syrian crisis. Thank you very much, Thanos. Now to you, Ambassador Martin Huth, to tell us about Germany. How is Germany coping with the problem? What do you think are presently the changing policies of Germany, if any?
مساء الخير. يعني بظن انه اول ما نبلش نتذكر شو قلت لك بالبدايه انه this is in English، بس علينا ايضا ان نعترف انه نحن يعني بالجامعه الامريكيه في بيروت، وبيروت هي العاصمه الجمهوريه اللبنانيه، ولبنان لغتها الرئيسيه هي العربيه. ومن هذا الباب أولا اسمح لي أن أوجه بعض الكلمات التقدير والشكر للمعهد عصام فارس ومديري الزميل العزيز والصديق الحبيب الدكتور طارق متري، وطبعا الفرقة التي تشتغل معه، ولكل الجهود اللي بذلتوا في تنظيم هذه الندوة. Switching to English, the question is, what is left for me to say? I've got 3 microphones, but probably little to say after what we heard from my colleagues. I can start by saying that stepping into AUB, I literally stepped into a piece of chewing gum, which is a sign of good luck, as much as it is an indication that, unfortunately, students both in Beirut and German universities share the same bad habits. So please stop throwing your chewing gum on the floor. I also wonder whether this occasion is somehow related to the fact that in 2 days we will be celebrating International Human Rights Day. I think it is very adequate to look at this issue also from the perspective of human rights. And that brings me to say, and maybe that's a little added value I can bring to this discussion, that we're dealing with a human phenomenon. And of course, directions to this phenomenon are human as well, and they are full of inherent contradictions. So there's no golden way, there are no absolute solutions, there's always a lot of misery and never perfect solutions. And in addition to this, I may say that this topic right now in Germany is probably the biggest policy challenge that the German government and in fact the German Chancellor are facing at this moment. So we're giving it top priority, and it is really, a big issue and difficult. I think it's also an issue that has to do with perceptions. So where do we all come from? In Germany, I suppose I can say we are a relatively big country. We are one of the leading economic powerhouses in the world. We come from the experience of our own history, the war, etc., and I think that somehow shapes our approach, sometimes even naive approach to this issue. Following the discussion in Lebanon, it is clear to me that the approach in Lebanon is shaped by different factors, and just to name a few, and the list cannot be exhaustive, one of them, of course, is the complex structure in Lebanon, of societal structure in Lebanon, the need to keep a balance, historical experiences that were made notably with other refugee communities, talk about the Palestinian refugees, and of course also there's sometimes good and sometimes not so good relations that this country has entertained with Syria. So I think these are, when we talk about a human phenomenon, also factors that really shape the situation. Tarek, I think you said at the beginning, you pointed a little bit at the, at least that's how I understood it, the differences in approach or the different situations faced by the countries presented here, the individual countries, Italy, Greece, and Germany. But I think we also have something in common, because we are the 3 countries that really share the biggest burden. Italy and Greece as first destinations, and Germany in many cases the desired final destination, or they as the first points of arrival, and we as the desired final destination. So I think we all have an interest in seeing the burden being shared equally between us. So what I would like to do is to, again, bearing in mind the need for bringing to this discussion added value, to quickly in a timeline fashion tell you how this whole thing developed in Germany, and then there's one specific point I'm going to make at the end. So the first point, if we go back in time, is to say that for Germany, the influx of refugees is not a first and singular occurrence. If we go back far in history, of course, my country is situated in the middle of Europe. It has always been a fact that different tribes, peoples, conquerors, invaders have crossed through this Central European region from all directions. So we have never been an island in splendid isolation. Coming more to the recent past, if we call the Russian invasion of Afghanistan or the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, the Balkan Wars in the mid-1990s, it was already in those occasions that Germany has taken in significant amounts of asylum seekers and refugees. You can add to this, of course, the phenomenon of desired and requested economic migration in the years after the war, when we rebuilt our economy and had a strong need for additional labor coming from outside. And I think it started with people coming, and notably from Italy and Greece and later on Turkey and other countries. So even in these previous occasions, we did make available significant contributions to support refugees, both in Germany as well as in neighboring countries of crisis, and that is notably true with regard to the Balkan crisis. However, Syria, and this has become clear today already, is really the biggest humanitarian challenge of the last 2 decades. It's actually been described also as the biggest refugee crisis since the Second World War. 11.5 million Syrians have fled their homes. Over 4 million Syrians have found shelter in neighboring countries, mostly Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. 7.5 million Syrians have been internally displaced, and several 100,000 refugees have embarked to Europe or other destinations outside the region. Now, these are huge figures. What about Germany? 286,000 Syrians have arrived in Germany from January 2015 until October 2015. The figures are growing, of course, but this is just meant to put things a little bit into perspective. Now, I'd like to give you a possible explanation of how the public perception in Germany has evolved over the last years and influenced the decision-making process of the parliament and government in Germany. The very first reports on the evolving civil war in Syria, of course, reached us in 2011, but they were seen very much in the context of the Arab Spring, these reports have been considered at the time as being relatively minor or of minor importance. However, the conflict, as we all know, escalated. More and more Syrians were internally displaced, fled to neighboring countries. And I think you will probably recall that in Lebanon, before Lebanon closed its borders more or less in 2013 and 2014, there was a massive influx of Syrians into Lebanon. But in Germany, political decision makers became increasingly involved and concerned as early as 2012, and then we began to develop programs or to facilitate the resettlement of Syrians in Germany, and there were programs that were designed to have 30,000 Syrians come to Germany in cooperation with the International Organization for Migration and the UNHCR. There were several such programs, and the last one was concluded in the autumn of 2015. What is important is that in late 2014, the German government made the decision to generally acknowledge refugees from Syria as refugees under the Geneva Convention. This is an important legal step because it entitled those who fell under this category a fast-track access to education, vocational training, and to the labor market. And I do not want to deny here the fact that labor was and is still being sought in Germany. Whether our demands can be satisfied by those coming in now through the Syrian refugee crisis is a different matter. But of course, one of the driving forces was also that there is a need for skilled labor in Germany. In early spring of 2015, Germany hosted a big refugee conference on the Syria crisis in Berlin. And in the late spring of 2015, so that is not so long ago, media reports came up about dead refugees in the Mediterranean, and these became a regular occurrence. And these reports quickly resulted in a shift of media discourse and public perception that was now suddenly overwhelmingly pro-refugees. We then stepped up massively our assistance in neighboring countries. We sent German Navy ships to rescue shipwrecked refugees to the Eastern Mediterranean, and even decided to unilaterally and temporarily suspend the so-called Dublin Accords for Syrian refugees, which means that we would consider their application for refugee status and asylum even if they had entered the European Union in another EU member state. However, what we see now in the wake of the resulting arrival of hundreds and thousands of Syrians to Germany is again a countershift of public perception. Citizens become more and more concerned about the capacity to host and integrate such large numbers of arrivals from another cultural background, and more conservative sentiments again seem to gain the upper hand in the public discourse. You may all be aware of the relative rise of right and far-right parties in Europe. That's a phenomenon from which Germany is not immune. We have not been affected by this phenomenon in the same extent as other countries, but the movement is certainly there as well. I cannot and I do not want to judge this overall process in Germany or the decisions that have been made, but I think it is already clear through the few things that I've said that there is a dynamic interdependence between politicians on the one hand and public perception on the other hand. And this well explains the sometimes haphazard mechanism and dynamism that is at work regarding the decision-making process. Two new developments have come up in the course of these developments, and that are quite different from prior refugee crises. One is that social media and socialized information channels today have a significant impact on the movement of refugees. Political decisions and political communication in Europe are instantly translated and made available even in Syria. This information is bent, it's interpreted, it's disfigured and perceived according to respective interests, and of course this is also where traffickers come in and give things a certain twist. And these things happen in less than no time. They happen simultaneously. So accordingly, the mobilization path and seas of refugee movements have become much more dynamic and thus unpredictable from the perspective of a recipient country like Germany. And this again in turn represents a challenge to our political decision makers. They have to react quickly, gauge the evolving crisis and refugee movements, while they have to predict and respect the development of the domestic discourse and altitudes. Just in a nutshell, to outline what we are trying to implement here in Lebanon, and I think Christina has outlined the same approach for the EU. We want to support refugees, vulnerable Lebanese and host communities alike, and we see this also as a contribution to stabilize Lebanon. Our main fields are humanitarian assistance, nutrition, education, and water. Education is very important, so I'm very happy to see Hala Hello here today, with whom we have wonderful cooperation in your ministry. Figures, everybody is showing off with their figures. So for Germany, 145 million euros for this purpose in 2015 alone. This was actually only my general introduction, and some nice people at the embassy, they prepared to me very detailed replies to all the individual questions, which I'm not going to give now, but I want to because I think it's important here and in Lebanon. I just want to give you briefly what I have here to the question D. What steps will be taken to integrate the refugees into the society and provide them with the adequate opportunities? Because I think that is also an issue that should be of great interest to Lebanon. I mean, everyone may have a different way to react to this, but you may like it or not like it. Integration is key. So the options depend on the legal status, of course. There are many difficult legal issues involved. Are you status according to the Geneva Convention? Are you just taken in for humanitarian reasons? But whatever category you're in, basic needs are covered in any case, and that includes, of course, the principle of respect for personal dignity and basic needs. Societies, that's a fact, they have a limited absorption capacity. So solidarity between states is key. And as I said before, the three states here probably have the biggest interest in seeing an equitable distribution of refugees over the European continent. Integration is a generational task. It cannot be achieved in a few months. It's easier to integrate children and youth as they are socialized through the educational system, so here again education is key. And best and worst practices from the past have to be taken into account. So ghettoization Does that ring a bell in Lebanon? Is not a good idea. Lingual integration, more a problem in Europe, is important, especially of parents, and the promotion of an open and tolerant society as a principle of social cohesion. And finally, and that's really my final point, because here in Lebanon, what we are doing in Europe and what we are doing in Germany is sometimes seen with a sense of surprise, even bewilderment, criticism. May go back to some of the local factors that I outlined at the beginning. And one of the arguments that we hear very often is, do you actually know who you're taking there into your country? Implying that Daesh is using the Balkan route, and there's so many terrorists among those refugees. I think it is very, very harmful to mix those two issues. There is, as far as I know, academic proof that the influx of terrorists through refugee flows is minimal, if it at all exists. However, I do want to concede the following. If we look at the Paris attacks, if we look at the Boston Marathon bombers, these were young men who grew up in those societies, frustrated, maybe jobless, never fully integrated. And of course, we might face the danger that with so many people coming in, that not everybody will be successfully integrated, and there is a challenge arising from there as well. So that cannot be denied and has to be taken care of as well. So I think I better stop here. Thank you.
شكرا يا صديقي العزيز مارتن على هذه المداخلة، وخاصة لأنك بيّنت أن هناك علاقة بين اتجاهات الرأي العام في المجتمع الألماني وسياسات صناع القرار، وأجريت مقارنة ولو نسبية مع لبنان، حيث بعض الاتجاهات في الرأي العام التي تتوجس بشكل مضخم من التوطين، ما يسمى التوطين، هذه الاتجاهات أثرت في صنع القرار اللبناني وحدت من إمكانيات الدولة اللبنانية على العمل بفاعلية أكبر في خدمة اللاجئين السوريين. I only said that I thanked Martin for his contribution, but I also added that it's good he focused on the relationship between public opinion perceptions and policy making in his own country. He drew a comparison with Lebanon, where we all know that the fear of final settlement of Syrians and Palestinians, the so-called Tawtin, is such that it has affected our ability, or the lack of it, to deal effectively with the problem of Syrian refugees in Lebanon, of hosting them better. Thank you so much. Last but not least is a speaker from UNHCR, and I think she has a lot to say. Thank you, Mireille Girard, for whatever you're doing, for all the good work, and for the intensification of your efforts in the light of all these developments in Europe.
Thank you very much. I think nothing much remains to say. First of all, thank you for the very kind invitation and all the active work of AUB on all issues related to humanitarian issue in terms of research, etc. So we're very grateful for that support of the government of Lebanon and the donors' support to help us do our job on behalf of refugees and affected local communities. So perhaps, if you would allow me, I would try to put a bit more perspective on the region here. One of your questions was about what can be done here. So since colleagues from the European Embassy can speak much more ably than me about what's happening in Europe, I will focus more about that. But just as an introduction, we spoke about 900,000 people arriving by sea out of 1 million refugee asylum seekers arriving in Europe, including by land. So that's a very big number. And I would like to say that 84% of these people are coming from the 10 most refugee-producing countries in the world. So this is clearly a refugee movement. As Christina was saying, a number of arrivals in Italy in particular are also arriving are also migration movement from some countries that are not experiencing particularly war or persecution, but the large majority are. And out of these 900, including some African countries also that are refugee producing, I'm speaking about Somalia, for example, or Eritrea. You have, out of this movement, 51% are coming from Syria. So it is not 1 million coming from Syria. Let's put things in proportion. And the majority of those that are arriving from Syria in Europe are coming straight from Syria. A smaller number are coming from Jordan and Lebanon or other countries in the region. And I'll explain what is pushing people to leave. But out of the, I think you were mentioning the departure in the region in general. 4.2 million Syrians have fled as refugees in the region, and they have also to the rest of the world, but they are mainly concentrated in Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, Egypt, and Iraq. So a number of countries, not only Lebanon, a number of countries in the region are affected by an additional number of persons to take care of. In Lebanon, as we know, it's 1/4 of the population. So this is the highest refugee concentration per head in the world. So is that as serious as that for a very small country? Recently there was a European Parliament conference hosted here in Lebanon with the parliamentarians of the region as well. And one parliamentarian was flagging that in terms of number, that number is 0.something% of the population of Europe. And it's much more in Lebanon. So putting things in perspective. This being said, what is very visible here in the region is the increased vulnerabilities of people. People cannot cope anymore. They're having more and more difficulties inside Syria and in the region. And the explanation is clear, is our global failure to address the situation in Syria, inside Syria, failures of the actors inside Syria to address the issue in their own country, the international community's failure to address the situation in Syria, and the challenges faced in the countries in the region to maintain asylum space for people that are staying here over now 4 or 5 years. All these challenges are pushing people to move on their own. So there's no secret. It's not by ignoring a problem that things are resolved. People are voting with their feet and they're moving as they're being pushed by events to find a solution for themselves. So instead of speaking about a burden, I'd like to speak about a responsibility. It's a collective responsibility for all of us, for people that are victims of a war that they didn't choose, and they are pushed. So they become at the charge of various countries on their way, but it is no choice of theirs. So on this, I would like to perhaps emphasize the contribution of the international community in general, and certainly, as Christina was putting, the European countries as individual countries and as the European Union are a main contributor to this response. If you take, Christina, you mentioned figures from 2012. If you take only this year in the region, the international community contributed 2.52 billion for the countries in the region to cope. And I'm not including here Syria. And here in Lebanon this year, close to $1 billion, $912 million were brought in addition to the Lebanon efforts to tackle the situation. To tackle it, so how do we cope with the situation here jointly with all the line ministries that are involved in the response? There is a common tool that is called the Lebanon Crisis Response Plan. That is a plan that is jointly owned by the government of Lebanon and the international community, in which we're trying to look at each sector of assistance and trying to respond to the needs. We're actually finalizing this week the plan for next year. And what this plan does, it really focuses on the most vulnerable among the refugees and the Lebanese communities affected by the presence of refugees, because it's impossible to address all needs. So we really focus on a safety net for the most vulnerable there. In terms of figures, just to give you a few ideas of what that covers, this plan of response, it includes, for example, safety net for those that are the most vulnerable to receive subsidy in terms of food, for example, to cover their food needs, and it cannot be the full food ration on top of it. So people have to complement with their own funds, because we can't give them food for enough. Only half of the refugee population are receiving food on a monthly basis, and they're not receiving the full ration. School, the international community is supporting the Ministry of Education to reimburse the cost of the school of the kids, the refugee children. The children are admitted that alongside Lebanese children in the school, there's no difference, but then the international community is trying to support those costs. Healthcare, primary healthcare is being subsidized, so when people go, it's less expensive for them. They pay only $2 instead of $8, which they can't afford otherwise. So this is another support by the international community, supported by all the actors that you see around the table here. We're supporting about like 1 million primary healthcare consultation this year, for example. This is huge amount of money. Shelter. Half of the refugee population is living in what you would call substandard shelter. So you see very often the tent settlements in the Bekaa. Well, you have also garages. You have animal stalls. You have unfinished houses. This is a very indignified way of staying, but people have no choice. This is where they're staying. And it costs $200 an average in rental. This is very expensive. And people are paying every month. So what is happening is that they're getting into a cycle of debt. They're borrowing money. They're delaying their payment. They're buying on credit. So they are sinking deeper and deeper into poverty. I'll explain that later. The big worry for us is winter, because in those kind of substandard shelter, winter is excruciating. It's very difficult. So we're trying to subsidize, together with the vulnerable Lebanese community, their cost for winter, to try to help them during the 4 harshest months of winter. People are really not only getting more and more vulnerable socioeconomically, but also morally. People are losing hope. They see the situation in Syria now. There's a Vienna process. There's a bit hope at the end of the tunnel, but everyone knows it will take time. And in between, people know they're not going to be able to go back tomorrow. They don't see how they can continue to cope here, and then there's no way to go elsewhere. So you understand why people are sometimes going into this desperate decision to jump into the sea, even if they know that their life are at risk. So this is the kind of situation we are. Despite all this amount of money that I mentioned, $1 billion here for Lebanon, we're only scratching the surface. We cannot do more than just helping the most vulnerable. So I gave you figures of debt. People have about, in average, $800 of debt per family. So you add, a $200 bill every month, electricity, water, residency permit, a number of things you have to pay. Your medical costs, heater in winter. It's impossible. So this is what we have. We have also now, compared to last year, between last year and this year, a number of the indicators have gone down 100%. When we had 50% of people last year living under the poverty line, this has gone up to 70% this year. 70% less than $4 a day. 50% now are below the survival line even. So they don't have enough, they don't receive enough. So this is why artificially they continue to borrow, etc., to continue to feed their children. This is the situation, and the local communities are more and more affected because it's been a long time now, and people have been extremely generous, and this is what the refugees are saying. If we lose that, we lose everything. If we lose the solidarity with the communities that have been so hospitable to us, particularly in the border areas, that are also the most defavorized communities of Lebanon, if we lose that solidarity, we're finished. So what we try to do, and together with the Ministry of Social Affairs, trying to keep that solidarity alive as long as possible by helping also the vulnerable communities around, trying to create job opportunities, more growth, basic services in the area. And then to finish really on this point, I would like to say what is needed now. What is needed is that there's clearly a realization that this crisis, and we all believed when it started, that it will last 6 months, 1 year, then there'll be, political settlement inside Syria, people will be able to go back. And this is what the refugees very much wanted to believe themselves. Now we're readjusting our plan, and we're clearly realizing we need a multi-year planning. It's just not going to even, and we believe in the political process. We hope it will happen, because there's only, as everyone was saying, a political solution to this. The key is in Syria, it has to be resolved so people can safely go back home, and the large majority want to go back home, for sure. People want to go back home. So what we're trying to do in between then, first of all, is to safeguard the safety net as long as possible, to make sure we can target the most vulnerable, But secondly, we have to look into the multi-year planning, and that is why it's important for refugees to be able to make it, to be able to manage themselves, to earn a little living so that they can pay their bills, they can stay legal, they don't have to send their kids to beg in the street, etc. So this is the basic minimum that is needed while we work on solutions. And I can speak here as UNHCR, our mandate is not only to help people in exile, but to help them find solutions. So once people are able to go back there, we will accompany them back home. For a couple of years after their return, we'll be doing programs to help them reintegrate so they can bounce and restart their life. Once a refugee is not a refugee anymore, that is when the job is finished for us. But as long as he's a refugee, we still. In between, the only solution that remains is resettlement. And that's why we're counting on the generosity of a number of countries, certainly Europe countries, Northern America, Australia, countries that are offering resettlement. So people can start a new life already now, not waiting for peace in Syria. So it's important. So we need to keep the safety net. We need to look at longer-term assistance for the refugees here. We need to support the institution of Lebanon, education, health, water and energy, all the ministries that are holding these services and making them available for an additional 1 million people in this country to keep going and to expand their capacity so they don't crumble under the mass of needs that are there. So that is critically important. And then resettlement, offering resettlement to reduce the numbers here in Lebanon until people can go back home. And I would like to conclude by saying that with this recent crisis, the movement to Europe, but also the influx from Syria, what we've seen is we've seen the best of humanity. We've seen the most generous gesture of the communities in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Turkey, in Egypt, in Europe. In Canada, everywhere in the world, people have reacted with a lot of solidarity, saying, what would happen? How would I like people to react if it was me, if I was fleeing? I think in Lebanon, it echoes a lot in a number of trouble Lebanon itself as a country has gone through, and that's why very quickly there was this generous gesture. But we've also seen the worst of it. We've seen a lot of xenophobia. We've seen a lot of nasty statement or gesture by people sometimes as people were fleeing desperate. And I think we have to make sure that it's the positive values that prevail in all of this. That's why you're here today, and I thank you for being here.
Thank you, Mireille Girard, for all the information you shared with us, but mostly for your concluding notes and invitation to all of us to be aware that this generosity, the solidarity of the Lebanese vis-à-vis their Syrian neighbors is essential for the future. Before I open the floor for discussion, I want to recognize a number of personalities in this room. Ambassador Badr Zayed from Egypt, Ambassador Alex Lennertz from Belgium, Member of Parliament Ziad Al-Qadiri, former ministers Saad Al-Urtas and Raya Al-Hassan, and the representative of the Ministry of Social Affairs, Madame Hello, and many other distinguished people in the room, but I just looked at the first row. We're very glad that you're all here. Now, I'll open the floor for discussion, for questions and comments, provided the comments are short. Wazir Urtas.
Well, Mr. Chairman, my name is Adil Kortas, former Minister of Agriculture in Lebanon. I would like to make 2 points. The first one is related to the fact that looking at the refugees' problems, the Syrian refugees' problems, not from the negative point of view, but from the positive point of view. This is cheap manpower in Lebanon. This is cheap manpower in Europe. I can use this cheap manpower to develop agriculture, for instance, to develop forestry. I know my Lebanese friends, nobody would like to work in agriculture. Nobody would like to work in construction and buildings. So why not using this cheap manpower, or you can use this cheap manpower also in Europe. My second point is related to the fact why we don't settle the refugees, the Syrian refugees in Syria itself. Because I know there are some parts of the country where you can settle them. This needs some investment and help and assistance to be provided to the Syrian government. Let us be frank and honest about it and deal with it in the positive way. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Fuad.
Good evening. Thank you very much. My name is Fuad from AUB. I had a feeling that this is really, you know, the panel was sort of very humanitarian / money / European issues. So where's politics here? I mean, there's nothing about the situation of inside Syria. What could be, you know, issues that be done. So what about, let's say, creating sort of safe zone inside Syria, or supporting sort of, you know, a border, let's say, areas that can be an asset for people to come back later on. So the issues of development, as Mrs. Gerard said, in the neighboring country, not just to support humanitarian issues. So I'm sure that there's a lot of politics, and you know that, but it seems that either as a diplomat, you avoid talking about politics, or maybe, I don't know, just encourage you to say that. Thank you very much.
Fadali. Yeah, I saw you. I saw your hands.
I'm Nawal Mdalali, a human rights activist. I have two questions, one for Mr. Martin and the other for Mrs. Mireille. Mr. Martin, do you think that the new crisis in Europe will be between the refugees and the host community? As we see now that Austria is building now a large war with Slovenia, and also they are closing, some countries from the European Union are closing their borders. And we see also in the USA, also there's the governors of about 30 states refusing to the refugees in the states. The second question is, Mrs. Mireille, do you have a solution for the Syrian youth in Lebanon that they are not registered with the UNHCR? We have a problem here because they can't work. They are now without residency, and they pass most of their time in jail because they have no legal papers in Lebanon. And why they can't travel? They like to travel. But why they can't travel and they are not refugees? Right. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's have one question per person. Huh? Fadali.
My question is for everyone. To what extent is it correct to call this crisis not a refugee crisis, but a policy crisis? Particularly a migration policy crisis and a foreign policy crisis. And when can we expect EU states to recognize the link between migration flows and political developments in the Middle East? So I'm thinking particularly about bombing Syria, which is encouraging the flight of Syrians, those few Syrians who actually had decided to stay in their country until now, and EU-Turkish relations, which have had, whenever there's evolved in a certain way, it's had a direct impact on the refugee flow through Turkey to Europe. Thank you.
Thank you. Second row, the lady. Yes?
Hi. Well, my question is for Mrs. Mireille. It is regarding the Syrians who have been detained in prisons in Hungary. And as we know, they are about 1,000. And some of them are already, they were already sentenced deportation, and yet they are still in the prisons. So what is the UN role regarding this issue, taking into consideration that they were crossing illegally and they were penalized for this, following international law that clearly said that they shouldn't be penalized? And well, Mrs. Christina have mentioned the solidarity among European countries regarding the Syrian refugees issues. Well, we all know that it's not the case in Eastern Europe, and we've seen the extreme measures that some countries are taking regarding the Syrian refugees issues. So for Mrs. Christina, do you think as well that, well,
One question.
One question.
Thank you. Fadal.
I have several questions.
One question only, thank you.
Make them one. I'll make them one about the political aspect of the situation. You've been talking how optimistic you feel about the Vienna talks and how they will kind of bring sort of a solution to maybe the crisis in Syria. But in all this talk, we all seem to realize, and as one of the former ministers just mentioned, that we should provide aid or help to the government or find safe zones in Syria. I don't know that we're really addressing the real problem in Syria, that majority of refugees first, before even ISIS existed, that came to Lebanon in 2013, they reached over 500,000. They were because of the regime in the bordering areas. And till 2014, before even ISIS got to the bordering areas around Lebanon, they were all because of the regime, not because of ISIS. So are we really discussing that we can have collaboration between the government and the international community, government in Syria and the international community in this refugee crisis? Or we should have a more like overview of all the problem, both of influences?
Thank you. Nora?
My name is Nora Bustani. I teach journalism at AUB. I was very touched by Mireille Girard's presentation and actually impressed that you're beginning to think of a multi-year plan, because let's face it, this problem is not going away anytime soon. Many of my students have been reporting on the conditions of Syrian refugees here in Beirut, in the Bekaa, in the south, and on the problem of education. I know Lebanese schools have tried to integrate as many as they can, but the figure is 175,000 out of 400,000 Syrian children who are eligible to be in schools. And this poses a problem for the future, both for Lebanon, for neighboring countries, and eventually for Europe. If these children are not taken care of, there is no way to guarantee that they will not at one point join ISIS or other groups or become radicalized in some way, especially if they're living below the poverty level, as you suggested. Now, not all of them can become physicists or astronauts. Can I just make a humble suggestion that while money is being spent on education in Lebanon and other neighboring countries, that countries such as Germany or Italy or Greece who know how to train people on vocational professions, carpentry, electricity, any of these things, that some of these children, if they don't want to go to school, they can be given some kind of training that will enable them to have jobs, enable them to be productive members of society, so they can help themselves and thus have more hope and more dignity. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take 3 more questions, and I see the 3 hands. That's the end of it. I'll ask you to be short. But I would like also to recognize Mr. Utku Atahan, the deputy head of Turkish mission in Beirut. Thank you for being here, sir. Fadal. I think you were first, then you, and then you.
Hi, my name is Kareem Shaheen. I cover the Middle East for The Guardian. I had a question regarding a point that Ambassador Huth made about the resurgence of right-wing politics in Europe. Do you see with the, if this influx continues over the next year, over the next 2 years, if there's no solution to the crisis in Syria, do you foresee, in addition to the rise of increasing right-wing politics, the collapse of the Schengen zone? Do you think that the Schengen zone will continue in its current form? I mean, we've already seen France taking extraordinary measures after the tragedy in Paris. But
thank you. 2 questions, but that's fine.
My name is Akram Mahani. I'm part of actually the research assistance team in this. I wanted to ask more, and the question is for everyone, about there's newly an emerging, I know a lot of INGOs are now doing protection projects in Greece. I'd like to hear a little bit more about that and EU's role maybe through ECHO, or maybe about what UNHCR are doing there, or if there's something similar in Italy. So I'm curious to know about this initiative. Thank you.
Yes. Last.
Hi, my name is Sami Kobaiter. The Syrian crisis started in 2011, but you haven't heard about the Syrian refugee crisis in Europe until 2015. What actually took them 4 years for Syrians to realize that Europe exists? Or actually what took Europe 4 years to start accepting Syrian refugees?
Thank you. We've had a number of questions on Twitter, but I'll only take one because we've had too many. It's a general question from Michael Battaglia. It says, political, economic, millions of Africans and Arabs desperate to get into, quote unquote, fortress Europe. What is your long-term solution? Into fortress Europe. What are your long-term solutions? So there are a number of questions. Some are specific and addressed, I think, mostly to Mireille Girard, so I'll ask her to give answers. Some are more general, addressed to all, and then I will leave it to the speakers to choose which one to answer. And there is a general question that has cut across many of the questions, that is, what about political solution? What about safe havens, no-fly zones, a corridor humanitaire, all of that in Syria? I remember the French spoke of corridor humanitaire, the Turks put on the table the no-fly zone proposal, and there was absolutely nothing about all of this for the last few years. Do we have anything to say about this as we discuss the future of, because no matter what political solutions there might be in the future, I don't know how near that future is, it remains that the problem of displaced people within Syria and refugees in neighboring countries will have to find a solution in Syria. Mireille.
Thank you. I have noted 3 questions. One on the issue of the residency permit and people who have gone illegal. The issue of illegal arrival and arrest for illegal entry in Europe, and the issue of education, technical education, etc. Now, on the first one, the issue is that to renew your residency permit in Lebanon, you need, as a refugee, but like other foreigners, you need to pay $200. I'm sorry? It's increasingly, it's not originally in the requirement, but it is increasingly put as a requirement now. But it's increasingly applied. I think they are correct. More and more it's ad hoc, so we're trying to negotiate and go back to the original requirement, which is if you have a UNHCR certificate, you don't need a sponsor. But I agree with you that it's in some areas, particularly in the Bekaa, it's being added as a requirement, which makes refugees, because it's very difficult to identify a sponsor if you're a refugee. So the issue is that with the level of debts people have, it's more and more difficult for them to come forward. Because originally the idea was, you know, you could go between Lebanon and Syria. There is an agreement that you can get 6 months free of charge that you can extend for another 6 months. What used to be the case, particularly when you had migrant workers here, etc., before the crisis, people would go back for 1 day and can come back and go back again into a cycle of 6 months free that you can extend. Now with the war, plus the visa requirement on the border, if you leave, you cannot come back because you don't meet the criteria, plus you sometimes just don't want to go because there's fighting on the other side. So people need to extend here, and that costs $200. That's the law for foreigners in general. That is impossible for refugees. It's more and more difficult. So we have 61% of people that have become illegal now. And for more than 87% of the families, at least one family member doesn't have the person, because they can't pay for everyone. So what we're trying to do, and we're working very closely with various ministries on this to try to look at, can those requirements be reduced for refugees, because they are not in the same position as any foreigner, and particularly they can't work, so they cannot generate income. They have to sign a commitment not to working. So while we're working on the longer term on the issue of access to work, maybe for limited period in certain limited domain where people could generate their income and therefore pay their fee, in the meantime, can this fee be reduced? Is although requirement, you have to also give a rental certificate, but if you live in a tent, you don't really have a rental certificate. You know, this kind of thing, making it adaptable to the refugee condition. These are things that they can do easily, therefore they can stay legal, because we all want people to be on the books. You know, both the authorities and UNHCR would like people to be legal. And then the first place, because as you say, it affects their capacity to move around. If people pass a checkpoint and they're not legal, then they are detained for illegal entry, then they're given a warning to regularize their stay within the next 2 weeks, or they can be deported. They are not deported. I mean, Lebanon is respecting the protection of refugees and is not deporting people, but it's scaring people, and therefore they don't move anymore. So that's the issue. So we would like to reverse a bit the cycle to make it possible for the majority to really extend their stay. That's one question. On the issue of entry to Europe, I will not speak about specific case, but in general, you know that for refugees, I think you mentioned that yourself. In the case of refugees, the law is different than for migrants. You can, as a refugee, it's understood that you may have to cross a border illegally. If you flee for your life, you don't have the time to ask for a visa, to get your passport. You know, no, you're just fleeing. You're running with what you have. So international law provides for refugees to be forgiven if they cross illegally. So the same way in Europe, and actually the asylum claims that are being processed in Europe, it's also on the basis that everyone knows they have arrived illegally and yet their claim is being considered. I think what is happening here is, and that's generally what European law and the human rights instrument in Europe are respecting very widely. What is happening is that among some of the refugees, there are among those people that arrive, some are considered to be more migrants than refugees, and therefore it's the illegal entry that applies for migrants. What we say as UNHCR is that everyone should be given a chance to have their claim heard. You may come from a country where normally there's no refugee produced, but you may have an individual case that is worthwhile listening and see if you're actually a refugee or not. So we advocate for a chance to be given for everyone to have their claim heard before a procedure of deportation or anything is put in motion. And lastly, on the education, yes, definitely, I think the government of Lebanon has said very clearly that local integration is not an option for the government of Lebanon, and this is what each state decides for itself. It's a state decision. What we're doing at the moment is pursuing resettlement and the return for when it becomes possible for people to return. But in the meantime, in terms of education opportunities, the Ministry of Education is developing at the moment an informal education framework, which is not yet in place. So once this is in place, we can certainly multiply the options of. Technical schools are in place. There are a number of refugees, but very few, too few, only a few hundred that have had access to them so far. We'd like more of them to be enrolled into those technical schools, because if you've been disconnected for 3-4 years from the school system, you want to learn mechanics or electricity wiring or something. You don't want to go back to learn math and stuff like this. It's something that will help you in the future. So I think this is very important to cultivate in the future, and this is the plan for next year, to have more and more of these technical and non-formal education opportunities available for children, so we can reach out to more of those who are not yet in the schooling system.
Thank you. Martin?
Thank you, Tarek. Just on a few of the questions that were asked, the issue of, as the former minister phrased, as cheap manpower. I don't mind using this term, and I suppose that we both agree we are talking about cases where people's dignity and well-being is not being compromised, where international standards are being kept, no child labor. So we're talking about making proper use of labor that is available. Yes, I do find that concept very, very interesting, and it strikes me somehow that this hasn't really been tried. I talked to somebody recently here at ESQA who said that he had made such a proposal to the Jordanians. I think the concept was about creating economic zones near the border with Syria, where the refugees are, investing, putting up some factories, getting people to work there, and win-win situation. Everybody's happy. Of course, it has to be economically viable, i.e., it means you cannot do that with people who are there 2 months before they go back to their country. Thinking of such a scenario in Lebanon, apart from that it seems to me to be a little bit too late to develop that idea, I think the situation is different from Jordan because we don't have a state here that is probably willing and interested, that's just my guess, to do the necessary investments, provide the infrastructure, and there are also some political considerations that come into this as well. I mean, I'd be very happy to see such a scheme develop, but I think the overall conditions in Lebanon are unfortunately not very conducive. And as far as we're talking about employing Syrian children in the cotton fields or whatever you have in the or wine picking areas in Beirut, you will understand that I have my reservations there. Safe zones, yeah, I'm very much for safe zones, but guess what? Safe zones have to be safe. And I don't really see that, and I don't see how in Syria we can identify some barren stretch of desert land and say, apart from the 7.5 internally displaced people, we take 4 million people in and we drop them there and then see what happens. I mean, from the perspective of my government, yes, but not viable at this stage. And that, of course, brings us to the other important issue that was repeatedly raised, politics. Now, as diplomats, we are never shy to talk about politics. We actually love politics. I mean, just to state the obvious, what we're doing is when we talk about our great contributions and help and assistance for refugees, it's just dealing with the consequences. Nothing of this has to do with dealing with the root causes. So let's look at the root causes. Let's try to solve the Syrian conflict. And as with all conflicts of this sort, too little has happened too late. I think that is very clear. I was posted in New York a couple of years ago while Germany was on the Security Council. I followed the Syrian dossier very closely in those days, and I have a personal feeling of what went wrong in those days. And now we're facing this mess. However, we're slightly more optimistic now with the Vienna process, and of course, all our effort, not all our efforts, but a lot of our efforts has to be geared towards finding some kind of solutions. We cannot leave Syria and the Syrian people in this misery. I think it's an obligation that we have all, and that of course applies to working on the root causes as well, and maybe all interested parties, even outside Syria, to develop a little bit more sense for compromise rather than I want this and I reject what you do. Question that was addressed to me, I think, about the rise of right-wing parties. I think I mentioned this already in my introduction. There are these feelings of fear. Let's say Germans identify themselves, if you ask them, as Northern Europeans with a Christian identity. The majority of Syrians who are coming are Sunni Muslims from the Middle East. So yeah, sure, there is a different cultural perception, but it all depends on how we handle this issue. I give you a very personal example. My parents, what should I say? I'm younger than I look. Okay, my parents live in a little village in southern Germany. My mother called me some weeks ago, and she said, "We just got news that in our village, by the end of the year, 300 Syrian men, no families, 300 Syrian men will be dropped in our village." And this is a situation we have in very many places in Germany. And of course, the question was, what will we do? What I hear from her is people in the village, they're getting together, they're trying to obtain a manual and ask themselves and say to themselves, well, we're facing the inevitable. It's not something we called for. It's not something that we necessarily like, but let's see how we can cope with it. So at this stage, it's positive. The 300 individuals have not yet arrived, and maybe at a future meeting, I can tell you how this story went. There was one thing about the collapse of the Schengen system. I mean, we have that more in the field of combating terrorism. In the wake of terrorist attacks, the countries, European countries, start closing their borders again for security concerns, and this is allowed under the current agreements for certain periods of time. I suppose what the question referred to more is what we've already witnessed is the collapse of the Dublin system, i.e., people should only be allowed to make a request for asylum, for example, in the country where they arrive, and not in the country of their final destination. This has been changed for some time, but I don't think that can be permanent. And regarding European solidarity, we always pride ourselves in saying we are a community of values. This refugee crisis has shown us that sometimes our national concerns and interests come way before the values, and I think we have to find a way to get back to our values. And one way of doing this is, of course, in sharing the burden. Thank you.
Thank you. Before it's too late, I have to recognize Ms. Helen Horsington, who's Deputy Head of the Australian Mission. Now, there are still three panelists who will have to say a few words, and then I will ask the President of the University, Fadlu Khouri, to give some concluding remarks if he so wishes. Lovely. So, Thanos.
I had a question about NGOs in Greece. So I just have to say that during all these months, NGOs have been present on the Greek islands. You must know that in most of the islands, I mean, in the smallest ones, the refugees were, the number of the refugees was higher than the number of the inhabitants. And the biggest islands are not more than 50, 60, 70,000 people. So, of course, we count a lot on the help of NGOs and, of course, UNHCR and all the international organizations. So yes, of course they're there now. I don't know many more details about specific things, but definitely they're present every day because you should know that this continues as we speak. It's not has not ended. Now concerning yes, of course the Schengen system. I don't think even higher border controls doesn't mean the Schengen system has collapsed, and also doesn't mean that the refugees arrive because of the Schengen system. And try to cross the border, so this is not the issue. Concerning the Dublin, of course, that cannot work anymore because you cannot imagine hundreds of thousands of refugees going back to Greece to be registered there. And
thank you, Massimo.
But certainly, everything is politics in this crisis. I tried to mention before what was the feeling of the peoples, the debate in Italy, but it's all totally politics: migration, humanitarian help, refugee, war, peace, negotiation, diplomacy. The Prime Minister of Italy said, for the money Italy will spend €1 for security, will spend €1 for culture. Life in the poor area of the cities where migration is becoming a huge problem because the fight has to be fought with the weapon, with culture, education, and whatever we have as a resourceful community. It's political in foreign involvement, engagement in the crisis, and the support and the participation, engagement in having a solution, political solution, before resorting to weapon is the key for this crisis. Regarding the use of labor, we are working with the UNIDO in Lebanon to create, to start up 3 industrial zones. So where Lebanese and even refugees, if allowed so, they might work and try to solve for the medium long-term issue. This is certainly one key for helping the refugees to give them back their dignity that they lost a long time ago. Those are wounded scar that last long time. We have also to take care of dignity, and this is one of the political issues that we have to address.
Christina?
Thank you very much. No, I agree with Martin and Massimo. I think diplomats love talking about politics, and all of this is politics. And basically, we're talking about the consequences, of course, of the situation in Syria. When Martin was in New York, I was in Syria myself. So I think looking back at these last 5 years, I wouldn't say that nothing has been done at all. There's been a lot of attempts, but you also need some political will from the people who are actually on the ground, and you also need political goodwill from the people in the international community to make those necessary solutions. I don't think there was maybe not any very obvious, very great solution anytime in these past 5 years. So I think while somebody was saying that we are very optimistic now about the Vienna talks, I think that's maybe, I didn't hear anybody say that, but at least we're optimistic that there's now a process and that you have everybody around the table who has some kind of interest in this conflict in Syria. So that's the good news of what happened in the last few months, and then we'll have to see if we should be very optimistic or not, but at least it's a good beginning. I think on a couple of those political questions, I mean, resettlement, we just don't see that there are areas in Syria where it's totally safe to resettle. One area that might be safe today is not necessarily safe tomorrow, and we've seen that over the last 3-4 months already. I mean, things are changing now. There's a Russian player in this situation too that also makes maybe zones that were considered safe before unsafe. So we haven't really seen that there are areas in Syria that we can just say this area is safe right now. The issue about safe zones, as Martin was saying, they have to be safe. And it sounds like such a nice and cute humanitarian idea, but this is a real military effort. If you want to do a safe zone, you need to have somebody from the sky protecting that safe zone with a big military operation. I mean, we had that for 10 years in Iraq, southern Iraq. There was a whole coalition of planes patrolling that area in southern Iraq in a very huge military operation. So it's not just something that you do. And on top of that, we barely don't like to mention it, but we had some bad experiences in the heart of Europe, in Srebrenica, where we had something we thought was a safe zone that we were not able to keep safe. So I think that's why, at least from the European side, we're not that happy about some of these suggestions. At least we need to be completely sure that we have international agreement, and then how do we keep these places safe, and the same also for resettlement. I think this is some of the main things I wanted to say. One thing maybe to Ms. Bustani talking about the education, I mean, I very much agree with what Mireille was saying too, and it is part of our, I mean, a very important part, maybe the biggest one, or growing at least, of the response is exactly education. Focus on education, 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 getting those kids in school, making sure that we don't have the situation that in a few years everybody is out. I think it was a success that we managed to get, everybody's combined effort, almost 200,000 extra kids into school in this campaign this year. But obviously there's some kids, like you were saying, who cannot really just go back to school because they've been outside for so long, and we need to find alternative venues for them, and vocational training is definitely something that we like very much from the European Union. We already have a lot of programs in that field, but of course the Lebanese government also has to agree that this is a venue that we want to use for this. I think this is it. If I should end just on one positive note, we talk a lot about these hostile or the mood in Europe being negative. I think we have to also look at some of these really interesting, spontaneous, positive reactions we also saw in Europe with the whole refugee welcome movements in many different countries. And it is, of course, a very, very new situation for Europe to have so many people arriving at the same time, and we are all struggling to deal with it. But at least I think it's much less black and white than maybe we tend to see portrayed in the press.
Yeah, if I may add one word about this whole discussion about safe zones and the protection of civilian population. I think there is another way of looking at it. As someone who served the United Nations in Libya, I know that the notion of responsibility to protect, which was a notion that was embraced in the international community, has suffered from an incredible setback, partly because of Libya, and it has been extremely difficult at the Security Council the last 5 years, since the demonstrations in Daraa that have called for the protection of the civilian population. It's been extremely difficult to bring this issue at the Security Council. So somehow the pendulum has swung back to a world of sovereign states, while it looked like a few years ago that the responsibility to protect as an international responsibility might determine a new configuration of world order. But that's history. Maybe. I'm thinking of that. Actually, we're planning here at this institute a meeting on R2P. So we would love to have you all in this debate. Now, if I may ask Dr. Khouri to give us his concluding remarks.
Thank you very much, first of all, for a fabulous panel. The director, Dr. Mitri, has assembled a formidable group of ambassadors and spokespersons, but more importantly, some very thoughtful individuals about a crisis which clearly has no obvious solutions. Although I tend to look at the glass as being more full than perhaps others, maybe that's my bias as an oncologist, but for every right-wing reactionary movement that we're seeing in Europe, we are seeing, for example, in Canada, the election of a legitimately compassionate, openly liberal prime minister, basically with the election largely turning on the issue of integration, welcoming, acculturization. I'm very fascinated with the discussion on education because AUB has always taken the lead, whether in the Palestinian refugee crisis or the Syrian refugee crisis, in terms of scholarship, education, and yes, really rising to the task of support. But there's a larger aspect that I don't think we got to touch on today. And when one thinks of the fact that the Paris attacks were carried out by European citizens who are fully educated, we may be missing the point that education is important but inadequate without cultural integration. And that is something that I didn't hear us really talk about today. I think not just for Lebanon and Turkey and for Jordan, but for the European nations that will eventually settle many of these immigrants, because Europe remains the population with a negative growth balance, Italy especially, with generation after generation having one child. The Chinese are told to have one child, you choose to have one child.
Sometimes we call it Chinese.
Yes. I think it's very important that we learn from the lessons of what failed to happen with Moroccan and Algerian immigrants to France. And that's where I think we can help, because at our crux, and that's the purpose of the Issam Ferris Institute, we're supposed to study a social phenomenon and come up with very useful reports like the ones that come up with and the ones that I know you will come up with about the state of the Syrian refugees, not just their education, but their integration into society, which is something with a government that has been paralyzed. It's very difficult to make a decision. It's not always a government decision. It can be a decision of NGOs and of universities. So I really appreciate all of your leading this dialogue, which will continue, and I suspect will eventually end with some very valuable information so that we don't, as a society, screw up the next refugee crisis to the extent that we did the Palestinian and the Syrian refugee crisis. That I'd like to say thank you very much again.
Thank you again, thank you so much. And thank you all for being here. À la prochaine.